In 1965, an elderly Robert Oppenheimer is interviewed by NBC for his role in the Manhattan Project. A theoretical scientist and director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during World War II, he's often described as the father of the atomic bomb. Nearly 2 decades after the atomic bomb's first test run, Robert Oppenheimer describes how he felt about the situation, surprisingly with a quote from the Hindu scripture known as the Bhagavad Gita.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
These were words spoken by Lord Krishna to Prince Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. The Hindu deity is trying to convince the hero of the story to listen, and does this by revealing his universal form, a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight for a mere mortal to witness. While doing this, Lord Krishna says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." You see, when Robert Oppenheimer said this quote, he did not see himself as Prince Arjuna. He was not surprised by the sight of a small star appearing momentarily on the Earth's surface. He saw himself as Lord Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, the all-powerful and all-seeing God. He fully intended to create this weapon from the very beginning. And while simpler individuals in the crowd watched alongside him in awe at the beauty of what was unfolding,
It was one of the most aesthetically beautiful things I've ever seen. On an enormous scale, this cloud was, and just tremendous billows, like a tremendous smoke cloud.
Mr. Oppenheimer, even 20 years after the first test of the atomic bomb, can't help but hold back the tears, knowing exactly what he had done.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
There is a new movie coming out today, if I plan this upload correctly. Christopher Nolan hopefully will do justice to this incredibly complex man's story. Robert Oppenheimer, through his research, would change the world as much as Barbie would help an entire generation of girls develop an eating disorder. And because this is Generation Tech, today I want to point out that Mr. Oppenheimer has a very similar proxy in the Star Wars universe. Another complicated, dark, brooding man, a highly intelligent individual living in a sea of chaos, which resulted in self-destructive behavior and a tortured existence. I, of course, am talking about Galen Erso, the premier galactic authority on crystallography and Kyber crystals' energy enrichment properties. There was a time when Galen Erso believed that he would save the world through his inventions. He would stop poverty and create the fusion reactor of his time. A Kyber crystal reactor that can output more energy than is beamed in. This is a truly humanitarian cause, free energy for the masses. See, Galen Erso was a pacifist, having viewed the horrors of the Clone Wars firsthand. This gentle and brilliant scientist wanted nothing more than to bring comfort to the troubled people of the galaxy. But the result of his research, however, would instead power the Death Star's super laser, one of the most devastating weapons ever created in galactic history. Mr. Oppenheimer's journey towards creating one of the most powerful weapons in our galaxy also started out with good intentions. You see, Robert Oppenheimer was mostly uninterested in politics and matters outside of the world of science and mathematics in the 1920s. But with the rise of fascism all across Europe in the 30s, Oppenheimer would grow increasingly involved and informed about the growing chaos across the Atlantic and even at home. He went from never voting in a political race, being completely unaware of the great stock market crash of 1929, which would lead to the Great Depression, to donating 3% of his salary, around $2,200 today, to German physicists trying to escape Nazi Germany, and attending fundraisers for the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War, a fight against fascism. At the root of Oppenheimer's own political awakening and 180-degree turn towards politics was his own personal background. Oppenheimer was a Jew, born in New York City in 1904. His parents had immigrated from Germany in the late 19th century. His father, Julius, was born in Hanau, a small town just 25 kilometers east of Frankfurt. Prior to the Nazi takeover in 1933, roughly around 500 Jews lived in the area. By 1942, the last Jews living in Hanau were sent to concentration camps in Eastern Europe. Out of the 525,000 Jews who lived in Germany in 1933, only 37,000 would be left by 1950. So many Jews had perished during the Holocaust that the largest population of Jews shifted from Europe to the United States by the end of the war. And I can imagine how Robert Oppenheimer watched all of this in terror and thought, had his parents not made the decision to immigrate to the States, there's a good chance that he would have been on one of those trains to the camps as well. By 1938, German scientists had successfully split the atom by bombarding uranium with neutrons. This was an alarming moment for the scientific community in the United States. In 1939, Albert Einstein would write a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt outlining his concerns about the Nazi plan to create the atomic bomb. FDR would approve funding for what would be known as the Manhattan Project in 1941, and Robert Oppenheimer was selected to lead the fast neutron calculations. He threw himself fanatically at this task, not only because of his scientific curiosity, but feared that the Nazis would reach the atomic bomb before the Allies would. Before we continue though, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, ownersaber.com, one of the premier lightsaber sellers in the Milky Way galaxy. Right now, all of their lightsabers are available for 30% off and free shipping until the end of July. ownersaber.com is always pumping out fresh new designs, either inspired by the films or new original designs like the Ronin's Rose. The Ronin's Rose's sleek and elegant design helps highlight the intricate engravings that can be found on this hilt. A rose-shaped hilt guard combined with a violet lightsaber blade completes the look of this unique weapon, which comes with both a RGB blade, good for dueling and sparring, and a Xenopixel blade, which has more robust visual effects. If you guys are interested in the Ronin's Rose and many other lightsabers, check out the description down below. Also, you can use our promo code EWALK, that's all caps, for an additional $15 off. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. Now, one of the major differences between Galen Erso and Robert Oppenheimer is that Galen Erso, at least in the beginning, was unaware that he was creating a superweapon. You see, Galen Erso, like Oppenheimer, was a mathematical genius and a child prodigy. But unlike Oppenheimer, Galen Erso's political awakening came very, very late in the game. For most of his career, he was just extremely mesmerized by his studies and by the pursuit of knowledge. Interestingly enough, both mathematical geniuses also had their own unique interest in mysticism. For Oppenheimer, quoting the Hindu scriptures was not just some kind of ploy he made for that interview. He was really interested in the Hindu religion. He had a deep fascination in the classical Hindu texts and enjoyed deciphering the cryptic messages and wisdom hidden deep within them. Like many geniuses, Oppenheimer and Galen Erso grew bored of the mathematical and scientific world they were experts in, and that was probably because of their intelligence. But in the mystical world, they found questions that had no true answer, and therefore they entertained themselves endlessly. For Galen Erso, his fascination into the unknown primarily surrounded one type of crystal, the Kyber crystal. During the Republic era, these crystals were jealously guarded by the Jedi Order. This monastic order had control over most of the major Kyber deposits in the galaxy, including the mines on Elum, and forbade scientific research into the Kyber. Unlike the Sith, the Jedi believed that such scientific investigations into aspects of the Force through which the Kyber flowed was perverse and could ultimately lead to dark side ambitions. Which of course only made Galen Erso even more interested in getting his hands on some Kyber crystals and researching what exactly made them tick. When the Empire finally destroyed the Jedi's monopoly on the Kyber crystals, they gave access to Galen Erso, and it was an offer he couldn't really refuse. And so for the longest time, Galen Erso believed in the Imperial version of the story, that the Jedi revolted and tried to overthrow Emperor Palpatine. Galen would be drawn in by the crystal's call through the Force and began developing a close bond with the Kyber, a sign that he perhaps was Force sensitive, or maybe that was just the crystal's ability to amplify this cosmic energy. Erso eventually became convinced that the Kyber crystals were sentient and that he could actually communicate with them and order them around. Whether they followed his orders was an entirely different thing. Erso also started getting nightmares and vivid Force dreams. Like most geniuses from Einstein to Galileo, Erso and Oppenheimer weren't what you would call religious men. They didn't believe in their religious institutions and texts that were clearly created by human beings. But they weren't so arrogant to assume that they had all of the answers, and they left room for the unknown. True intelligence is usually the acceptance of a level of uncertainty, which leads to innovators and creatives asking questions and pursuing answers that more closed-minded people would simply ignore or discard. Another difference between Oppenheimer and Galen Erso is the latter, while extremely intelligent, lacked ambition. He was oftentimes described as a free spirit. Galen was more interested in pursuing whatever his mind wandered towards, especially before being introduced to the Kyber crystal. And unlike his classmates, when he graduated, Galen Erso did not accept the lucrative offers from military contractors or military defense companies. Instead, he would go to work in the energy sector with Zircon Industries. Galen Erso's research was focused on growing synthetic crystals that could hopefully be used as a source of inexpensive power. But disaster would strike with the beginning of the Clone Wars. Galen Erso's entire family would be caught up in a separatist coup, and he would be captured and held for ransom. A year later, however, Galen's old friend and schoolmate Orson Krennic, a member of the Republic Special Weapons Group, would come to his rescue. At the time, the Special Weapons Group, without the knowledge of many senators and also the Jedi, were secretly working on their own project that would one day become the Death Star. You see, the Republic had news that the Separatist Alliance had already started the process of building a similar superweapon. Just like how the US was racing against the Nazis to create the atomic bomb, the Republic was racing the Separatists to create a super laser. By the end of the Clone Wars, Galen Erso was offered a position in the Empire's Project Celestial Power, a cynical attempt to hide the Death Star program and pretend that it was a humanitarian project to develop cheap and unlimited energy through using Kyber crystal. This entire farce was clearly made to convince Galen Erso to get on board. But Galen Erso was blinded by the Kyber crystal. He was obsessed, and for 2 years he would keep his head down and continue to make breakthrough after breakthrough. But Galen was far too smart to ignore his growing suspicion that what he was creating was not some type of new energy source, but the foundation of some kind of super weapon. Especially when Orson Krennic failed time and time again to show how his research was being applied to actual reactors. Erso would eventually find a way to escape from the program with his family. Interestingly enough, he would leave all of his research notes on the project behind. Galen Erso believed that this would actually delay Orson Krennic, and that was because his notes were so complicated that no one could really decipher them. In this way, he was very similar to Robert Oppenheimer, who also wrote plenty of papers that were extremely complex to read. Now, while heading the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer really just had one major concern, and that was these constant accusations that he was in fact a communist. Like many intellectuals in the 1930s, Oppenheimer would dabble in socialism, but he was ultimately turned off by the application of socialism in Eastern Europe during this time period. And so, other than occasional FBI investigators interviewing him about his political beliefs, the physicist was thoroughly invested in the pursuit of the atomic bomb. He would continue to push the development of this bomb until the very end of the war, when it would be used not against the Nazis, but at Hiroshima against the Japanese Empire. Now, the ethics of the Americans dropping the nuke on Nagasaki and Hiroshima is a very complicated debate that honestly deserves its own video. But what I do want to highlight is that 11 days after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Oppenheimer would write to the US government that he believed that nuclear weapons should be completely banned. And months later, he would admit to Harry S. Truman that he knew he had blood on his hands for his role in the program. Interestingly enough, Oppenheimer never regrets making the bomb. After all, he had lived through a time period where the Nazis were in fact in an atomic bomb race against the Allied powers. This would have been terrifying. It's possible that Oppenheimer had even read the US Army's proposal for an all-out ground invasion of the Japanese mainland and how many casualties that it would cause on both sides of the war. But immediately after the war, Oppenheimer would spend the rest of his life advocating against nuclear proliferation. He would watch in horror as the United States and Soviet Union engaged in a maddening nuclear arms race. The tears we see him shed in that NBC interview were real and showed us the complexity of this man and how he ultimately dealt with his own actions. Galen Erso, on the other hand, would find some peace in hiding on the world of Lamu with his wife Lyra and his newborn daughter Jin. He had grown accustomed to the life of a moisture farmer and was at peace with his new existence. Unfortunately, Orson Krennic would find him and his family. During the confrontation, Orson's wife would attempt to kill Krennic and would be gunned down as a result. Luckily, little Jin had already escaped by then with the help of their neighbor and friend Saw Gerrera. With little left to lose, Galen Erso would make a stand, a much more subtle and less public stand than the one Robert Oppenheimer makes after the war, when he goes on all of these speaking tours and has all of these interviews. Galen Erso decided that he would help Orson Krennic develop his super weapon. He came to the realization that even if he refused and was killed by Krennic, someone else could complete his research eventually. And so instead, Galen Erso would purposely engineer a fatal flaw into the design of the weapon that could be exploited by the enemies of the Empire. a flaw that he would pass on through a desperate network of defectors, spies, and desperados, his own daughter, until it finally reached the Rebel Alliance during the Battle of Yavin. And the rest is history. Both Galen Erso and Robert Oppenheimer have massive amounts of blood on their hands. Both men were scientists, thinkers, and innovators, not politicians or military men. And despite the fact that neither individual pulled the trigger on their doomsday weapon, they both would still devote the rest of their lives to fighting against the very demons they had unleashed. Both men are controversial individuals. Both men have tremendous amounts of blood on their hands. But if there's one lesson we can learn from their stories, that is, no matter what we do in life, when we have a mistake, when we create a sin, whether it's something as large as creating a super weapon or something as small as dropping a bomb in our girlfriend's toilet and destroying the plumbing, we're nothing if we don't try to face the damage we create and try to fix it.
Robert Oppenheimer.